There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
In episode 29, titled Mistakes Were Made, I made the following statement.
It's called your appendix. You will read different things about it, but the bottom line is that you don't really need it, not anymore anyway.
Since then, a few of you have written in to tell me that I may want to dig a little deeper, that there might actually be a use for it after all. So let's do that together. Welcome to the world of the appendix.
The vermiform appendix, though an important organ in some classes of animals, appears, at least occasionally, to be very mischievous in the human body.
Those words were captured in the meeting minutes for the Surgical Society of Ireland. The meeting took place in 1842. The appendix, to be honest, has perplexed doctors ever since. Well, ever since there have been doctors and a medical science for them to practice in. Leonardo da Vinci was the very first person to describe the appendix, so at least it started with an illustrious past. Now, if you're wondering, the appendix isn't very big, not for something that can cause so much pain when it becomes inflamed and threatens to burst. It's only a little over 2 inches long. It looks like a small pouch, and it's located where the small intestines meet the large intestines. The funny thing is, when it's removed, your body doesn't seem to care at all. It only cares when there seems to be a problem with it, and then your body breathes a sigh of relief when it's gone. And good riddance to it. For years, and by years I mean centuries, it's been considered what is known as a vestigial organ. A vestigial organ is one which has lost its original function, its raison d'etre, or reason for being. It's a lost soul trapped in a body that couldn't care less whether it stays or goes. The main school of thought was that the appendix, at least as far as our appendix goes, was once the cecum. In the rest of the animal kingdom, specifically in herbivores, it's known to store bacteria which helps to break down plant food into digestible bits. Carnivores, on the other hand, have little need for a large cecum, so it's much smaller, and in our case, as the theory goes, it's nothing more than, well, nothing.
Not only is it useless, but it is sometimes the cause of death, of which fact I have lately heard 2 instances. This is due to small, hard bodies, such as seeds, entering the passage and causing inflammation.
That was Charles Darwin in his 1871 classic work, The Descent of Man. He was, of course, talking about the appendix. Now, he was of the mind that it had evolved from its initial state of a bacteria-rich cecum to the useless little pouch that it appears to be. The way Darwin saw it, as did many after him, it played a large role in our early stages of development as a species, especially when our diets consisted mainly of leaves and plant foods. It was responsible for breaking down cellulose. That was until we discovered how to cook and essentially changed our diets. A pot on a stove or over an open fire is essentially another stomach for us, an artificial man-made stomach meant to process foods before they are consumed. Cooking served to break foods down into something more digestible. The cecum's job became redundant. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck would say it's a classic example of use and disuse. I love bringing Lamarck up, if only because he was so wrong in some ways and so absolutely right in others. Anyway, if you're not familiar with Lamarck, he was famous for explaining changes in body traits and shapes as being the result of how they were used. It was his theory on inheritance. Giraffe necks became longer because they stretched and strained to get to the higher leaves. Some moles became sightless because they didn't really need their eyes to see with underground. The opposite of extended use. The cecum, Lamarck would gleefully point out, and probably did, shrunk into the useless appendage it is because animals stopped using it, just like our tails. They're still there, but only a shrunken version of them is still visible. Darwin, in his theory of natural selection, explains it in another way. It's evolution from a necessary organ to a, what did he call it?
It is useless.
Right, a useless organ. It became useless when a mutation hindered its operation. In the distant past, when we relied on it to help break down plant foods, anything that had a negative effect on its operation would have caused irreparable damage to the organism itself. Thus, it would die long before it had a chance to reproduce. That's natural selection at work. But as our diets and food preparation activities evolved, when a mutation happened to stroll along and set up shop in our cecum, our body shrugged its shoulders and moved the cecum's desk to the basement. Its job had been phased out and nobody cared. So when the organism survived, and survive it did in spite of its malfunctioning cecum, it passed that malfunction on to its offspring, and so on. And it didn't happen overnight. This prolonged transformation from a cecum to a useless pouch, that we call an appendix, took millions of years. Now, this wasn't the first time that Charles Darwin talked about such things. He had done so as well in On the Origin of Species in 1859.
An organ, serving for two purposes, may become rudimentary or utterly aborted for one, even the more important purpose, and remain perfectly efficient for the other.
What the appendix was efficient for, he couldn't say. If he'd had anything in mind, he tossed that away when he called it useless.
Again, an organ may become rudimentary for its proper purpose, and be used for a distinct one.
So, all seemed to agree, for as long as we had a word to describe it, that the appendix had lost its usefulness a long time ago. And you can't really blame anyone. The past is littered with things that we no longer use but had once served a purpose, like 8-track tapes. Hand one of those to someone under the age of 20 and ask them what it is. Though sometimes, just like with vinyl records, something that was once considered useless will make a comeback. In 2007, Dr. William Parker and his colleagues at Duke University began to take another look at the appendix. Dr. Parker's area of interest is the human immune system. Now, while taking their closer look, something interesting began to emerge. Something that had always been there, but had remained hidden or unobserved for centuries. Function. Your ears are working just fine. I did say function. So, when I said,
You don't really need it, not anymore anyway.
I was wrong. Now let me explain it like this. Our intestines are full of good bacteria. Now this good bacteria prevents bad bacteria from moving in and setting up shop. It also, in essence, trains our immune system by stimulating it to produce antibodies which go after bad bacteria and other pathogens. So imagine this. This good bacteria is busily working away, minding its own business while we go about our daily lives. They help us, and in turn, we provide the good bacteria with a safe haven on which to thrive and to reproduce. It's a pretty healthy relationship. But every once in a while, we, meaning you and I, get sick. And sometimes that sickness produces bouts of diarrhea, like dysentery, which is an inflammation of the intestines. Even mild bouts of diarrhea wreak havoc on our digestive system. You don't really need me to tell you this though, right? What it also does is flush out the good bacteria. After the sickness passes, the good bacteria begins the process of repopulation and life goes back to normal. But how is it repopulating? Wasn't it all flushed out? After World War II, the fear of atomic weapons was high. The United States had entered the era of the Cold War, and that was an era which was to continue until the early 1990s. The fear was that the United States and the Soviet Union would cease its quiet hostilities and come to open blows. Now, these blows would take the form of nuclear weapons. So, to combat this fear, and in some cases capitalize on it, bomb shelters began to appear in people's backyards. These were supposedly safe havens where families could escape to and wait out the war. Now, remember the good bacteria that came out to repopulate? After sickness had swept the intestines of its brothers and sisters, where do you think that they might have been hiding to wait out the war? I'll give you a hint. It rhymes with William Bendix. That's right, the appendix. What Dr. Parker and his colleagues have found is that the appendix serves as a safe place for good bacteria. They live there until they're needed, far enough away from the trouble of sickness to avoid being flushed out themselves. Now, if you're wondering why it's okay to remove your appendix and to not suffer any ill effects, you have to remember, in our age of medical care and sanitary practices, the need for this reserve of good bacteria isn't as essential as it used to be. Now, that's not to say we can completely do without it. We can. But those instances which wipe it all out are not as common as they used to be. Just like the bomb shelters from the 1990s. I would guess that most of those relics of the Cold War are gone now. I would also bet that some might still remain, collecting dusts and cobwebs. But if you go in with a backhoe and pull it out of the ground, it's not the end of the world. So what about appendicitis? Doesn't the appendix sometimes become inflamed and present a health risk? Well, yes, it does. But that's not because it's not working properly. The way Dr. Parker puts it,
basically your immune system is a kind of a bored teenager, and we just need to give it something to do so it doesn't cause problems.
idle hands are the devil's playground, right? I wonder what your tonsils excuse is. Or was. Evolution Talk is written and produced by myself, Rick Coast. The song you heard near the beginning of the episode, that was composed by the brilliantly gifted musician Tim Bickford. Additional music was composed and performed by the equally talented Chad Crouch, also known as Poddington Bear. Support for Evolution Talk comes from you, simply by listening. And if you enjoyed the show, please share it with someone. You can also help the show end its continued existence by visiting evolutiontalk.com/support. But most of all, thank you for listening, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Qu'est-ce que c'est l'appendix? What is an appendix? Everyone knows what is an appendix. It is a thing in the head. In the head. Now Madeline has a hole in her head.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.